The station called Axiom Prime floated in the darkness between three dying stars. And it was here that the galaxy sent its finest young warriors to train for battles that would shape the fate of entire civilizations. Kira Vance stood in the massive entry hall with her single bag over her shoulder and watched as creatures she had only seen in classified briefings walked past her without a second glance. She was 24 years old, and she was the first human being to ever set foot in the Galactic Military Academy. Earth had made contact with the Concorde only 3 years ago, and humanity was still considered what the aliens politely called a primitive evaluation species, which was their way of saying that humans were on probation, and nobody expected much from them. The entry hall stretched upward for what looked like a mile, and Kira had to crane her neck to see the ceiling where lights like captured stars cast everything in a cold blue glow. A creature with 4 arms and skin like burnished copper walked past her and laughed at something its companion said. And Kira noticed how its muscles moved like cables beneath that metallic skin. These were the Raxi. She knew from her briefings, warriors who could crush stone with their bare hands and who had conquered 12 star systems before joining this Concorde. Behind them came a group of tall and impossibly elegant beings with bones that seemed to be made of living crystal, and light refracted through their translucent skin in rainbows that shifted with every step. The Velthari were considered the most physically perfect species in known space, and their skeletal structure was harder than diamond while being lighter than aluminum. Kira looked down at her own hands, at her soft skin and her bones that she knew were made of calcium and collagen, and she wondered for the first time if she had made a terrible mistake. "Human," a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find a Velthari administrator holding a tablet and looking at her with what she had learned to recognize as contempt mixed with curiosity. "You are to report to the ranking hall in 1 hour," the administrator said without any greeting or welcome. "Do not be late." The ranking hall was a circular chamber with seats rising up in tiers like an ancient coliseum, and Kira found herself standing in the center with 199 other cadets. While machines scanned their bodies and minds, she watched the results appear on massive screens that floated in the air, and she watched her name sink lower and lower on the list. Velthari cadets clustered near the top with their perfect bones and their efficient metabolisms and their resistance to radiation that would kill a human in minutes. The Raxi came next with their 4 arms and their strength that could tear through hull plating, and their ability to survive in vacuum for up to 10 minutes without protection. The Mindori, small and fragile-looking creatures with oversized heads, ranked high because their psionic abilities let them coordinate attacks across battlefields and predict enemy movements before they happened. And at the very bottom of the list, in the position marked 200 out of 200, was the name Kira Vance. The hall went quiet when her results appeared on the screen, and she could feel every alien eye turning toward her. No psionic ability whatsoever. The screen declared radiation resistance far below acceptable military standards. Skeletal structure classified as fragile compared to all other species present. Expected combat lifespan 14 minutes against standard Dominion forces. And then the final insult that made several Raxi cadets burst into barking laughter. Total expected lifespan 70 to 80 years. The human does not even live for a full century. One of the Velthari said loud enough for everyone to hear. Why would the Concorde waste resources training something that will die before it can be useful? Kira said nothing because there was nothing to say. She was smaller than everyone here, and weaker than everyone here, and she would die of old age before most of these cadets reached what their species considered middle age. The administrators assigned quarters, and Kira found herself sharing a room with a Velthari female named Sareth, who looked at her the way someone might look at an insect that had crawled into their home. "I requested a transfer," Sareth said as she arranged her belongings on her side of the room. "I do not wish to share space with a creature that will slow me down." "I understand," Kira said quietly, and she meant it. That night she could not sleep, and so she walked the halls of the academy with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes taking in everything. Around her she found the Hall of Legends by accident, a vast chamber filled with statues and murals depicting the greatest warriors the galaxy had ever known. There were Raxi generals who had held back invasions with nothing but their bare hands and their fury. There were Velthri champions who had dueled for hours without rest and emerged victorious through skill and endurance. There were Mindori tacticians who had won wars without ever lifting a weapon simply by outthinking their enemies. And, at the center of it all, on a pedestal that glowed with strange energy, sat a hammer. It was not a large weapon, perhaps 3 feet long, with a head that looked like it was made from the heart of a dying star. But something about it made Kira stop and stare. She read the inscription carved into the pedestal in a language that her translator chip rendered into English. Whosoever lifts the hammer of Kethra shall command the vanguard. Below that, in smaller text, was another message. None have proven worthy in 4,000 years. Kira stood there looking at the hammer and feeling something stir in her chest that she could not name. Do not waste your time, human. She turned to find an old Raxi with scars covering half his face and a uniform that marked him as a senior instructor. That weapon is gravity-locked, the instructor said with a smile that showed teeth like knives. It simulates the surface gravity of a neutron star concentrated in the handle alone. Kira did not fully understand the science, but she understood the meaning. Every great warrior in the history of the Concord has tried to lift it. The instructor continued. Velthri, with their perfect bones, have had their arms shattered. Raxi, with their incredible strength, have been crushed to the floor. Even the greatest Mindori telekinetics have failed to move it a single inch. He leaned closer, and Kira could smell something like copper and ash on his breath. It has broken the arms of gods. Little human, and you are no god. He walked away laughing, and Kira stood alone in the hall with the hammer that no one could lift. She looked at her hands again, at her soft human hands with their fragile bones and their weak grip, and she thought about what the instructor had said, but she did not leave. She stood there until the artificial dawn began to brighten the station, and she stared at the hammer that had broken gods, and somewhere deep inside her, in a place where humans kept the stubbornness that had carried them down from the trees and across the savannas and up into the stars, a small voice whispered a single word: maybe. Training began 3 days later, and Kira learned very quickly that being ranked last was not just a number on a screen, but a reality that followed her everywhere she went in the combat simulations. She was always the first of all because her reflexes were slower than the Velthri, and her strength could not match even the weakest Raxine. The tactical exercises, the Mindori cadets linked their minds together and moved as one perfect unit, while Kira stumbled through alone, unable to hear the psionic commands that guided everyone else in the endurance chambers designed to test resistance to extreme conditions. She burned under radiation that the others barely noticed, and she gasped for air in atmospheres that the aliens breathed without effort. You should withdraw, an instructor told her after the first week. There is no shame in admitting that your species is not ready for this level of training. Kira thanked him for his concern and reported to the next exercise. She failed that one too, but Kira had learned something in those first terrible days. Something that the aliens did not seem to notice about themselves. The Velthri were fast, and their crystal bones made them incredibly strong in short bursts. But she watched them carefully and saw that they tired quickly and needed long rest periods between efforts. The Raxi were powerful beyond anything she had ever seen, but their four-armed bodies generated enormous heat during exertion, and they had to stop frequently to cool down or risk dangerous overheating. The Mindori could coordinate perfectly through their mental links, but when those links were jammed or disrupted, They became confused and frightened. Unable to function as individuals, every species had weaknesses that balanced their strengths, and Kira began to wonder what strengths might balance her own many weaknesses. She started training alone at night when the other cadets were resting. Academy had a running track that circled the outer ring of the station, and Kira began using it after the evening meal while everyone else relaxed or slept. She ran for 1 hour the first night and returned to her quarters with her legs burning and her lungs. A Chingzereth looked up from her studies and wrinkled her nose at the smell of human sweat. "What were you doing?" her roommate asked with obvious disgust. "Running," Kira said simply. "For how long?" 1 hour. Sarah stared at her for a long moment and then shook her head and returned to her work without another word. The next night, Kira ran for 90 minutes. The night after that, she ran for 2 hours. By the end of the first month, she was running for 3 hours every night without stopping. And the other cadets had begun to notice. A group of Velthari followed her one evening, curious about the strange human who seemed to spend all her free time in pointless movement. They watched her run lap after lap after lap around the track, and after 40 minutes they grew bored and left. Kira kept running. A Mindori medical officer stopped her one night as she was leaving the track, her shirt soaked with sweat and her legs trembling with exhaustion. "I must scan you," the Mindori said with concern in its large dark eyes. "I have been monitoring your vital signs remotely, and I am worried." Kira stood still while the alien ran its scanner over her body. The Mindori's eyes went wide. "Your muscles," it said in a voice that mixed confusion with something like fear. "They are damaged. The fibers are torn, and the tissue is inflamed. You are injuring yourself." Kira nodded because she could feel the truth of those words in every step she took. "Why do you continue?" the Mindori asked. "Why do you not stop and allow yourself to heal?" Kira smiled even though the expression made her cracked lips sting. "Because when they heal," she said, "they will be stronger than before." The Mindori stared at her as if she had said something in a language its translator could not understand. "That is not how bodies work," it finally said. "That is how human bodies work," Kira replied, and she walked away to shower and collapse into her bed for a few hours of sleep before the next day of training began. Word began to spread through the academy about the strange human who exercised until her body broke and then exercised. More cadets would sometimes gather to watch her train, fascinated by the sight of a creature actively damaging itself in pursuit of some goal they could not understand. Zareth came to watch one night and stayed for the entire 3 hours. Her crystal features unreadable as Kira ran and ran and ran. When Kira finally stopped, her roommate was waiting for her with a container of water and a question. "On your world," Sareth asked slowly, "did all humans do this?" Kira thought about the question as she drank. "We used to hunt by running," she said. "Long ago, before we had weapons or tools. We would chase animals across the grasslands for hours and hours until they collapsed from exhaustion." Sarath's eyes widened. "You would chase them until they died from running?" "Yes, but you are slower than almost every creature I have seen," Sareth said. "How could you catch anything by chasing it?" Kira finished her water and looked at her roommate with tired eyes. "We could not catch them in a sprint," she admitted, "but we did not need to. We just needed to keep following, to never stop, to always be there behind them every time they looked back." She paused and wiped the sweat from her face. "Eventually, they would overheat, or their legs would give out, or their hearts would fail. And we would still be coming, still walking, still refusing to stop." Sarah said nothing for a long moment. "That is terrifying," she finally whispered. Kira shrugged her aching shoulders. "That is what we are." Later that night, Kira went to the Academy archives and asked the AI system a question that had been forming in her Mine for weeks. What is the highest gravitational force a human has ever survived? The AI processed her request and displayed its answer on a glowing screen. The data is incomplete, it reported. Human gravitational tolerance has never been tested to the point of failure. The species has survived all controlled tests administered thus far. Kira stared at those words and thought about the hammer in the Hall of Legends. What about other species? She asked, what is the highest gravity the Velthri have survived? The AI showed her a number, and the Raxi? Another number, higher than the first, and all other known species in the Concord? A list appeared with numbers beside each name. Every species tested and measured and cataloged. Kira studied the list and noticed something interesting. Every species had a failure point, a gravity level where their bodies simply stopped working, but humans had only a question mark because no one had ever pushed them far enough. To find out where they broke, she thought about the hammer again, and she thought about the inscription on its pedestal, and she began to form a plan. The dropship shook violently as it descended through the thick atmosphere of the jungle moon called Vareth 7, and Kira gripped her restraints and tried to keep her last meal from coming back up. Around her sat the other members of her assigned squad. Sarath the Velthri, a massive Raxi gunner named Torax, and a small Mindori tactician called Whisper, who earned the name from the soft way it spoke through its psionic link. None of them had wanted Kira on their team, but the Academy assigned squads randomly, and there was nothing to be done about it. 30 days. Torax growled as the ship descended. 30 days of survival and combat exercises on a world with hostile wildlife and enemy simulation units hunting us. He turned his 4 eyes toward Kira, and his lip curled back from his teeth. Try not to slow us down too much. Yulin, Kira, said nothing because she had learned that words rarely changed minds, and actions were the only currency that mattered. The dropship landed hard in a clearing surrounded by trees that towered hundreds of feet into a sky the color of bruised fruit. And the squad grabbed their gear and moved out before the ship lifted off again. First thing Kira noticed was the gravity. Vareth 7 had a surface gravity of approximately 1.6 times Earth standard, which meant that everything weighed 60% more than it should. For Kira, this was uncomfortable but manageable, like carrying a heavy pack on a long hike. For her alien squad mates, it was much worse. The Velthri were adapted to a low-gravity homeworld, and Sarath's movements became stiff and careful within the first hour as her crystal bones strained under the extra weight. Torax the Raxi was strong enough to handle the gravity, but his massive body generated heat at an alarming rate as his muscles worked harder than normal, and he had to stop frequently to vent thermal energy from the cooling systems built into his species' biology. Whisper, the Mindori, struggled most of all, its thin limbs shaking with every step and its large head drooping as if it might fall off its fragile neck. But Kira walked steadily forward, her human body doing what human bodies had done for millions of years, adapting, enduring, refusing to quit. On the 5th day, everything went wrong. They were ambushed by a simulated enemy unit in a valley choked with fog, and before anyone could react, Torax took a training round to his lower left arm that triggered his suit's injury simulation and locked a limb in a rigid splint. Whisper tried to coordinate a retreat through the psionic network, but a jamming field activated, and suddenly the little Mindori was cut off from all mental contact. Alone in its own head for the first time in its life, it started screaming. Zareth tried to carry Whisper to safety, but the gravity was too much, and her left leg made a sound like breaking glass as one of her crystal bones fractured under the strain. The squad was scattered and wounded, and the enemy was closing in. And that was when Kira took command. Sarath, she said in a voice that cut through the chaos, "Can you still shoot?" The Velthri nodded through her pain. "Then find cover and provide suppressing fire. I will handle the rest." Before anyone could argue, Kira moved. She grabbed Whisper who was still screaming and thrashing, and threw the small alien over her shoulder. Then she bent down, and with a grunt of effort, she lifted Thorax. All 400 pounds of him plus his gear, plus the extra weight from the gravity, and began to carry them both. Sarah stared at her with an expression that might have been disbelief or might have been something else. Entirely. That is impossible, she whispered, but Kira was already moving, already running through the fog with 2 aliens on her back and the enemy closing in behind her. She ran for 6 miles. She did not stop when her legs began to burn or when her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. She did not stop when Thorax regained consciousness and told her to leave him behind, or when Whisper finally stopped screaming and clung to her neck in terrified silence. She did not stop when the gravity pressed down on her like a giant hand trying to crush her into the mud. She ran and she ran and she ran because that was what humans did. And she would not let her squad die on this miserable moon so far from home. 19 hours later, she staggered into the emergency extraction zone with both aliens still on her back and collapsed face first into the dirt. Medical teams rushed forward and pulled her squad mates away, and someone rolled her over and pressed a scanner to her chest. She should be dead, the medic said in a voice that shook with disbelief. Her muscles are destroyed. Her joints have swollen. She has stress fractures in both legs, and her heart has been beating at maximum capacity for almost 20 hours straight. The medic looked down at Kira, who was staring up at the strange purple sky with eyes that could barely focus. How are you still alive? Kira tried to smile, but she was not sure if her face obeyed. Stubborn, she managed to say before everything went dark. She woke up 3 days later in the medical bay with Sarath sitting beside her bed. Her roommate's leg was wrapped in a regeneration cast, and there were dark circles under her crystal eyes that suggested she had not slept much. Your squad won, Sarath said quietly. We were the only team to complete the exercise with all members alive. Kira tried to sit up and failed. The others? Thorax will recover fully. Whisper is still shaken, but the medical staff say the psychological damage is not permanent. Sarath paused and looked at Kira with an expression she had never shown before. You carried us for 6 miles in gravity that was crushing me just standing still. You ran for 19 hours without stopping. You should have died a dozen times over. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What are you? Kira thought about the question, and thought about Earth, and thought about her ancestors who had chased their prey across endless grasslands under a yellow sun. Tired, she said honestly, but not done. Sarath made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. The instructors have updated your ranking, she said. You jumped from 200 to 97 in a single day. Kira closed her eyes and let herself rest. It was not enough. Not yet, but it was a start. In the command center of Axiom Prime, a scarred Raxi general named Vareth pulled up the classified files on humanity and read them for the first time since Earth had made contact with the Concorde. His eyes moved across words like persistence predator and endurance hunting and thermoregulation through sweating. He read about how humans had once chased animals across African plains for hours and hours until the animals simply fell over dead from exhaustion. Easy. Read about how human muscles were designed for sustained effort rather than explosive power, and how human bodies could repair themselves faster than almost any other known species. And he read the final line of the assessment that some xenobiologist had added as an afterthought. Recommend extreme caution when engaging humans in extended conflicts. They do not appear to understand when they have lost. General Vareth closed the file and looked out his window toward the Hall of Legends, where the Hammer of Kethra waited on its pedestal for the first time in centuries. He felt something that his species had almost forgotten how to feel. He felt afraid. The war came without warning, as wars often do. Kira was eating breakfast in the Academy dining hall when the alarms began to scream and red lights flooded every corridor with the color of blood. the Hive Dominion, enemies of the Concord for over 1,000 years, had launched an attack on a colony world less than 2 jumps from Axiom Primal. Cadets were recalled from training exercises, and the station began preparing for possible siege in the chaos that followed. Kira found herself standing with Sareth and Torax and Whisper, her squad from Vareth 7, watching transport ships arrive carrying wounded soldiers and terrified refugees. They hit 3 outposts before anyone could respond, Torax said grimly. His 4 arms crossed over his massive chest. The Dominion is testing our defenses. They are looking for weakness, Whisper added, its voice soft in Kira's mind through the translator. They always look for weakness. Kira watched the wounded being carried past and thought about weakness and strength and the things that people believed. About a commotion near the entrance to the hall caught her attention, and she turned to see a group of Velthari cadets pushing through the crowd with an arrogant young male at their center. His name was Corvith, and he was the son of a noble house that had produced warriors for 10,000 years, and he had ranked 3rd in the academy before Akira's impossible performance on Vareth 7 had begun to shift people's opinions about what rankings truly meant. He spotted Kira across the hall, and his perfect crystal features twisted into something ugly, human. He called out loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I have a challenge for you." The dining hall went quiet as cadets and instructors alike turned to watch Corvith ward Kira with his followers trailing behind him like a comet's tail, and stopped just a few feet away from where she stood with her squad. "Your little performance on that moon has confused some people," he said with contempt dripping from every word. "They think that perhaps humans are not as worthless as we believed." Kira said nothing and simply waited. "I wish to clear up this confusion," Corvith continued. "I challenge you to the trial of Kethra." A gasp ran through the crowd. The trial of Kethra was an ancient rite that any cadet could invoke, a test that required the challenged party to attempt to lift the legendary hammer in the Hall of Legend. Success meant instant promotion to command rank, and glory that would last for generations. Failure meant expulsion from the academy, and shame that would follow the cadet for the rest of their life, and no one had succeeded in 4,000 years. "If you refuse," Corvith said with a smile that showed teeth like shards of ice, "you admit that humans do not belong here, and you leave the academy in disgrace. And if I accept," Corvith laughed, "then you die trying to lift a weapon that has crushed warriors 100 times stronger than you will ever be." Kira looked at the Velthari, noble, and thought about everything she had learned since arriving at Axiom Prime. She thought about the nights spent running until her legs gave out, and the muscles that had grown back stronger. Each time they tore, she thought about carrying her squad mates through gravity that should have killed her, and the 19 hours of running that had somehow not been enough to stop her heart. She thought about the question mark in the academy database where her species failure points should have been. "I accept," she said. Corvith's smile widened. "The trial will take place tomorrow at dawn. Try to get some sleep. Human, it will be your last." He walked away with his followers, and the dining hall erupted in whispered conversations about what everyone had just witnessed that night. Sareth came to Kira's quarters and found her sitting on her bed reading through files on her data tablet. "You cannot do this," Sareth said without any greeting. "The hammer has killed Velthari champions who were stronger and faster and better than Corvith could ever dream of being." "I know," Kira said without looking up. "The gravity field increases exponentially as you approach the handle. By the time your fingers touch the grip, you will be experiencing forces that would crush a starship hull." "I know." Sareth grabbed the tablet from Kira's hands and forced her to look up. "Then why?" she demanded. Why throw your life away to prove a point to an arrogant child who is not worth your death? Kira looked at her roommate, at the being who had once refused to acknowledge her existence, but who now stood here with tears forming in her crystal eyes. I am not trying to prove a point to Corvith, Kira said gently. I am trying to prove something to everyone else. She stood and walked to the window, where she could see the stars scattered across the void like dust. Humanity is new to the galaxy, she said. We are small and weak, and we die so quickly that most species cannot even remember our names before we are gone. She turned back to Sareth. But we did not climb down from the trees and cross the oceans and reach the stars by being careful. We did it by being too stubborn to know when we were beaten. Sareth shook her head. Stubbornness will not help you lift that hammer. Maybe not, Kira admitted. But I have been thinking about why everyone fails. She pulled up a file on her tablet and showed it to Sareth. Every species approaches the hammer the same way. They rush in and try to grab it quickly before the gravity can build up. They think speed will save them, and it does not. No, because the gravity field responds to approach speed. The faster you move toward it, the faster the resistance increases. Everyone who has ever tried has been crushed by their own urgency. Sarah studied the data with growing understanding. You think if you approach slowly enough, the field will not spike. I think the hammer was not built to test strength. Kira said, I think it was built to test something else. Something that no species in the galaxy has more of than humans. What? Kira smiled, and it was not a happy expression, but it was a determined one. Patience, endurance, the willingness to keep going when everything is telling you to stop. She closed the file and looked at her friend. The hammer does not need someone who can lift the most weight. It needs someone who can hold on the longest. Sareth was quiet for a long moment. You could still die. She finally said, yes, and you are going to do it anyway. Yes. Sareth nodded slowly and reached out to clasp Kira's hand in her own. Her crystal fingers cool against Kira's warm human skin. Then I will be there to watch, she said. And whatever happens, I will make sure the galaxy knows what you tried to do. Kira squeezed her friend's hand and looked out at the stars one more time. Tomorrow she would either lift the hammer or die trying. Either way, humanity would no longer be forgotten. The Hall of Legends had never been so full. Every cadet in the academy stood in the tiered seating that rose up around the central chamber, and behind them stood instructors and officers and visiting dignitaries who had heard rumors of what was about to happen. Admiral Vestris herself had come down from the command deck to watch. Her ancient Velthory form supported by a hovering chair that kept her frail body upright. At the center of it all sat the hammer of Kethra on its glowing pedestal. Waiting as it had waited for 4,000 years, Korth stood before the crowd, with his chest puffed out and his crystal features arranged in an expression of supreme confidence. As the challenger, I have the right to attempt the trial first, he announced. Watch closely, human, and see what true strength looks like. He approached the hammer with long, graceful strides, moving quickly as every challenger before him had done, certain that his speed and power would carry him through. His hand reached toward the grip, and the gravity field activated with a sound. Like thunder. For 1 second, Corvith seemed frozen in place. His arm extended and his fingers inches from the handle. Then his elbow shattered. The crack echoed through the silent hall as his crystal bone exploded into fragments under the impossible weight. And his scream followed a heartbeat later as he collapsed to the floor. Clutching the ruin of his armed medical teams rushed forward and carried him away, while his followers watched in stunned silence. The hammer sat on its pedestal as if nothing had happened. Admiral Vestris leaned forward in her chair. Human, you may now attempt the trial. Kira stepped forward from the crowd and walked to the edge of the raised platform where the hammer waited. She was wearing simple training clothes, and her feet were bare because she wanted to feel the floor beneath her and know exactly where her weight was centered. She did not look at the crowd or the admiral or the hammer. She looked at her own hands and remembered all the times they had gripped things they should not have been able to hold. Then she began to move him like every challenger before her. Kira did not rush toward the hammer. She took one slow step forward and stopped. The gravity field activated, but because she was moving so slowly, it did not spike the way it had for Kolveth. She felt the weight settle onto her shoulders like an invisible cloak, pressing down but not crushing. She took another step, the weight increased, and she felt her knees trying to buckle, but she had spent months training those knees to hold weights. They should not have been able to bear another step. Her spine began to compress, and she could feel the vertebrae pressing together in ways that sent lightning bolts of pain down into her legs and up into her skull. Another step, blood vessels burst in her eyes, and her vision went red at the edges, but she did not need to see clearly. She only needed to keep moving forward another step. Her teeth cracked from how hard she was clenching her jaw, and she could taste blood in her mouth, but she swallowed it and kept going. Another step. She was at the pedestal now, and the hammer was right in front of her, and the gravity was so heavy that she could feel her heart struggling to pump blood upward into her brain. She extended her hands slowly, so slowly that watching her was like watching a glacier move, and the gravity field screamed around her fingers as they inched toward the grip. Minutes passed. The crowd had stopped breathing. Sarath was gripping Tarax's arm so hard that her crystal fingers were leaving marks in his copper skin. Whisper had its eyes closed and was sending prayers to every god its people had ever worshipped. Kira's fingers touched the handle of the hammer. The weight was beyond anything she had ever imagined, beyond anything that should have been survivable, beyond anything that made sense in a universe governed by physical laws. Her body began to break. She could feel bones cracking in her hand and her wrist and her forearm, tiny fractures spreading like ice on a frozen pond, but she did not let go. She closed her fingers around the grip and began to pull. The hammer did not move. Kira sank to one knee as the gravity tried to crush her into the floor, and she felt something tear in her shoulder, but she kept pulling. She screamed, not in surrender, but in defiance, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs and older than her species. And the hammer moved 1 millimeter, then 2, then a centimeter. The crowd gasped as the legendary weapon began to lift from its pedestal. For the first time in 4 millennia, Kira rose from her knee with the hammer in her hand and the gravity field howling around her like a living thing trying to push her back down. She lifted it higher. Body was failing in 100 different ways, but her mind refused to accept what her body was telling it. She was human, and humans did not stop when it hurt. They stopped when it was done with a final scream that seemed to shake the walls of the hall itself. Kira lifted the hammer of Kethra above her head and held it there. For 3 seconds she stood with the weapon that had broken gods raised toward the ceiling. A small human woman doing what no alien had ever done. Then her body finally gave out and she collapsed, the hammer falling from her hands to ring against the floor beside her. The gravity lock deactivated with a soft click. The hammer had found someone worthy. Chaos erupted in the hall as medics rushed forward and cadets began shouting, and the admiral rose from her chair for the first time in Decadesrith, pushed through the crowd and fell to her knees beside Kira, grabbing her shattered hand and holding it gently. "You did it," she whispered. "You impossible creature. You actually did it." Kira could barely see through the blood in her eyes, but she managed to smile. "Told you," she said in a voice that was barely a whisper. Stubborn. 3 weeks later, Kira stood before the assembled leadership of the Galactic Concord with her arm in a regeneration cast and her body still covered in healing bruises. They had named her Vanguard Commander, the first in 4,000 years. And they wanted to know how she had done what no one else could do, a diplomat from a species Kira did not recognize asked the question that everyone was thinking. How did you lift what all others could not? Kira looked at the gathered leaders of 100 worlds and thought about Earth and her ancestors and all the Impossible things that humans had done throughout their history. You saw an impossible wait, she said. I saw a fight that would take longer than a few seconds. She paused and looked at her healing hands. Where I come from, we do not stop when it hurts. We stop when it is done. The chamber was silent. That night the Concorde updated their records on humanity. The classification, primitive evaluation species, was deleted and replaced with new words that would change how the galaxy thought about the small blue world called Earth. Strategic threat. Priority ally. Do not engage in extended conflict. And in the Hall of Legends, artists began work on a new mural beneath the hammer of Kethrate showed a human woman on one knee with the weight of a neutron star pressing down on her shoulders. Body was broken, but her eyes were defiant and above the image. Carved in letters that would last for eternity were words that every species in the galaxy would come to know. She did not stop.